A man was carried into a public square in Istanbul in 1561. He was alive. He would remain alive for some time. That was the decision someone had made, not out of rage, not out of cruelty in any personal sense, but as a calculation. The wooden stake had been measured. The angle had been checked. The position had been chosen with the kind of deliberate care that a craftsman brings to precision work. Because the goal was not his death. Death would come. The goal was the time between now and then, and what that time would produce in everyone who witnessed it. Around him, the square filled. Not soldiers summoned to watch. Not officials fulfilling a duty. Ordinary people. Men going to the market. Women walking to prayer. Children who had simply followed the crowd. They stopped. They looked. And somewhere behind them, unseen but absolutely present, the Ottoman state watched them watching. Because this was never about the man on the stake. It was about every person who would walk away from that square and spend the rest of their lives carrying the memory of what they had seen. The Ottoman Empire was one of the most legally sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world. Its courts impressed foreign ambassadors. Its judges handled commercial disputes with a procedural rigor that non-Muslim merchants crossed borders specifically to access. Scholars who studied it wrote of a civilization that had learned to balance power, law, and authority in ways that most empires never managed. That same civilization built this. Not alongside the law. Not in spite of it. Through it, and because of it, and in ways that made the two things inseparable from each other. This is the part that did not make it into the official legacy. This is the part they did not write down in the legal codes, because it did not need to be written down. It functioned because everyone already understood it. We go exactly where they did not want us to look. The Ottoman public square in the mid-16th century was not an empty space between buildings. It was infrastructure. In an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Persian Gulf, where a vast portion of the population could not read, where a single imperial decree might be written in Arabic script and reach a village of Greek speakers in the Balkans, the square solved a problem that paper could not. It communicated in the one language that crossed every boundary of literacy, religion, ethnicity, and class. Pain made visible. Consequence made permanent. A merchant walking toward the spice market might pass a set of hands nailed to the city gate before he reached the first stall. Not tucked away. Not obscured. Nailed at eye level, facing outward, positioned so that every person using that entrance would have to look directly at them. A head mounted on a spike at the entrance to a government building, angled not inward toward the officials, but outward toward the street, toward the foot traffic, toward the people who had no official business there at all. A body left in the place where it fell for 3 days after an execution. 3 days specifically. Not 2, not 4. Someone had calculated that 2 days was not long enough for the message to fully circulate. Not enough people would pass through the area in that time. And after 4 days, the physical reality of the body became something else, something that produced responses other than fear. 3 days was the operational sweet spot. That decision had been made by someone who understood crowds, memory, and the physics of public communication. These were not the accidents of a brutal era. They were outputs of a system. Outputs that someone had engineered, tested, and refined. The executioner in a major Ottoman city was not simply a man assigned to kill. He was a specialist. His training covered not just the mechanics of death but its choreography, how to position a body for maximum visibility, how to sequence the components of a public punishment so that the crowd's attention built rather than peaked and collapsed, how to extend a process so that it remained legible as punishment rather than tipping into something the crowd could dismiss as simple chaos. There are accounts from the period of European diplomatic observers who watched Ottoman public executions with a kind of horrified fascination, not at the cruelty specifically, but at the professionalism. The deliberateness. The fact that every element appeared to have been thought about. And in the same letters, those same observers wrote admiringly about the Ottoman court system. That is the detail that tends to get lost when the history gets simplified. The men who designed and ordered and approved the spectacle in the square were not separate from the men who impressed foreign visitors with the sophistication of their legal institutions. In many cases they were the same men, operating in different modes of the same machine, applying different tools to different problems. When a dispute over inheritance needed resolution, the tool was the court, evidence, testimony, procedural rigor, written judgment. When the state needed something else, when it needed a population to feel something rather than understand something, the tool was the square. One machine. Two outputs. Neither one contradicting the other. What foreign observers tended to miss, what the Ottoman state was in some ways invested in them missing, was that the sophistication of the courts and the deliberateness of the square were not in tension. The courts produced legitimacy. The square produced compliance. You needed both. Legitimacy without the capacity to enforce it was fragile. Enforcement without legitimacy eventually collapsed into something the population rejected entirely. The Ottomans had understood, over centuries of imperial management, that these two things needed to be kept in careful balance, and that they needed to be kept visually and institutionally separate, even though they fed each other. The judge who issued a fair verdict was not the same man who calculated the angle of the stake. But the judge's verdict reached the square. And the stake reached back into the courtroom, not visibly, not explicitly, but as a weight behind every ruling that was made there. This was the architecture of Ottoman power at its most functional. Not the palace, not the army, not even the legal codes. The architecture was the distance between those two things, the court and the square, and the invisible channel that ran between them. The square also served a function that did not appear in any official document but that the state understood intuitively. It managed memory. A crowd that witnessed something together did not process it the way an individual processes information. The collective experience of a public execution created a shared reference point in a community. For years afterward, in some documented cases, for decades. People in Ottoman cities would describe events in relation to what they had witnessed in a square. They would date other things by it. They would use it as a shorthand for consequence, for authority, for the particular flavor of fear that came not from the threat of punishment but from the memory of having already seen what punishment looked like up close. The state did not need to threaten most people most of the time. It had already done the work. The memory was circulating in the population on its own, passing from person to person in the retelling, growing in some details and shrinking in others, but always preserving the essential core. The state had done this, the state was capable of doing this, and the state had chosen to make sure you knew about it. That was the system. And it started somewhere much quieter than a public square. The Ottoman legal system was not one thing. It was two things, running in parallel, overlapping in places, kept deliberately separate in others, and the space between them was where the state did its most important work. The first system was the Sharia court. The qadis who presided over these courts were trained scholars, men who had spent years mastering Islamic jurisprudence. Their jurisdiction covered the full range of civil life. Inheritance disputes, commercial contracts, marriage, divorce, the custody of children, property boundaries, debts. The records they kept were meticulous. Foreign merchants who did business in Ottoman territories regularly praised the Qadi courts as reliable, incorruptible by the standards of the era, and procedurally fair. Non-Muslim minorities, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, used them voluntarily, not because they were required to, but because the courts had built a reputation for competence that their own community institutions sometimes could not match. The second system was the canon. This was the sultan's secular law, a body of edicts, rulings, and precedents accumulated over generations of imperial administration. The canon governed matters the Sharia courts did not fully reach. Criminal law, provincial administration, military discipline, tax collection, and the regulation of trade guilds. Different sultans added to it. Different regions had local variations. It was, in the language of modern legal theory, a living document, constantly being updated to address the practical needs of running an empire that spanned 3 continents. The two systems were not supposed to conflict. Islamic jurisprudence acknowledged the legitimacy of secular administrative law in areas where divine law was silent or ambiguous. And in practice, the two systems mostly coexisted without friction, referring cases to each other, acknowledging each other's authority, maintaining the fiction of a unified legal order. But there was a gap. It was not a gap in the written law. Both systems had extensive written codes. It was a gap in what the written codes admitted to. The canon specified punishments for crimes, but it did not specify how those punishments were to be carried out in public, who was to be present, how long the process was to last, what was to be done with the body afterward. The Sharia court issued verdicts but did not control execution. The gap between a verdict and its implementation, that space, that moment of transition, belonged to neither system formally, which meant it belonged entirely to the state informally. And the state had opinions about how that space should be used. A Qadi could issue a ruling that was, by every standard of the era, entirely fair. Evidence weighed. Testimony heard. Punishment proportionate to the crime. That ruling might then be carried out at noon in a public square, in front of the maximum possible audience, by an executioner trained not just to kill but to extend the spectacle. The fairness of the verdict and the deliberateness of its execution were not contradictions. They were features of the same machine doing different jobs. The Qadi's role was to produce legitimacy. The public execution's role was to produce fear. You needed the Qadi first, because fear without legitimacy was tyranny, and populations eventually resist tyranny. But you also needed what happened in the square, because legitimacy without fear was weakness, and other powers, rival governors, rebellious provinces, external enemies, would eventually test it. There was a third element, less visible than the courts or the square, but equally important. The sultan's administrative officials, the Beylerbeys who governed provinces, the Sancakbeys who administered districts, had significant discretion in how imperial law was applied locally. This discretion was not accidental. It was designed to allow the state to calibrate its response to local conditions without requiring a new legal ruling each time. A governor who understood the political situation in his province could decide that a particular punishment needed to be public and prolonged, or private and swift, or applied to one person as a message to another person entirely. This calibration, who gets punished, how, where, and in front of whom, was the real legal architecture of the Ottoman state. Not the codes themselves, but the space around the codes where human judgment operated. And that judgment was almost never random. It was almost always strategic. The question then becomes, what were the specific tools in that space? What did the Ottoman state actually do when it decided that a verdict needed to produce maximum effect? What were the technologies of fear it had developed, refined, and applied with such deliberate precision? The answer is more systematic than most people expect. The Ottoman state had at its disposal a range of punitive tools that varied enormously in their severity, their visibility, and their intended audience. Understanding how those tools worked requires setting aside the assumption that more extreme always meant more effective. The Ottomans understood something that many modern observers miss: the goal was not to maximize suffering. The goal was to produce a specific response in a specific audience. Sometimes that required the most extreme possible public act. Sometimes it required something much more precise. Impalement was the tool that appears most frequently in European accounts of Ottoman justice, partly because it was so visually striking that diplomatic observers could not help but describe it in detail, and partly because the Ottomans used it for a specific category of offense. It was reserved primarily for crimes that threatened the legitimacy of the state itself. Rebellion, treason, conspiracy against the Sultan. The message it sent was not simply that these acts would be punished. The message was that the state had the capacity and the willingness to make punishment an experience that outlasted the criminal himself, in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. The technique was not improvised. The stake had to be long enough, smooth enough, and angled correctly to avoid immediate death. The executioner's knowledge was specific and practiced. Too steep an angle and the condemned died quickly, defeating the purpose. Too shallow and structural failure could end the spectacle prematurely. The goal was a duration measured in hours, sometimes longer, during which the condemned remained conscious and visible to the crowd. This was not sadism in the ordinary sense. It was engineering. Bastinado, the beating of the soles of the feet, was at the opposite end of the severity spectrum, but it was used far more frequently. It had a property that made it extraordinarily useful for administrative purposes: it was precisely calibrated. A light application produced pain and humiliation but left the recipient able to walk and work within days. A moderate application produced lasting discomfort and a noticeable limp. A severe application could cripple permanently. An extended application could kill. The same tool, applied by the same executioner, could produce outcomes ranging from a warning to a death sentence, depending entirely on duration and force. This calibration was the point. The state could send different messages using what appeared to be the same punishment. An official who had committed a minor infraction might receive bastinado and return to his post the following week. An official who had committed a serious infraction might receive bastinado and never walk without assistance again. Both had received the same nominal punishment. The difference was visible only in the long-term outcome, which was itself a message to every other official watching. Flaying, the removal of skin while the subject remained alive, was reserved for a category of criminal the state treated differently from all others. Not because their crime was necessarily the worst in terms of its immediate consequences, but because of what their betrayal represented symbolically. Governors who had defected to enemy powers. Military commanders who had abandoned their positions in battle. Officials who had been trusted with imperial secrets and sold them. These were punishments not for the act itself but for the rupture it represented, the violation of the trust that made the imperial system function. The Janissary Corps, the elite infantry that formed the backbone of the Ottoman military, had their own relationship to public punishment that was distinct from the civilian population. When Janissaries were punished, it was almost always publicly, and almost always in front of other Janissaries. This was not primarily about deterrence in the abstract. It was about maintaining the internal hierarchy and cohesion of the corps. A Janissary who watched a senior officer executed for corruption understood something specific, that the corruption, not the officer, was what the state would not tolerate. The punishment was also a kind of institutional speech, directed at the corps as a whole, reminding them of what they were permitted and what they were not. There was one category of criminal for whom the approach was entirely different. This was not just a cultural assumption. Ottoman jurists and administrators wrote about it, discussed it, and built it into their thinking about how punishments should be conducted. A punishment that produced ibret was not just lawful, it was fulfilling its proper function. A punishment that was lawful but produced no ibret was, in a meaningful sense, wasted. It had consumed a resource, the condemned, without generating the corresponding return. The crowd was not passive in this system. Their presence completed the punishment. A public execution without witnesses was, in Ottoman administrative logic, barely a punishment at all. It was a private act that generated no currency in the economy of public order. The crowd's presence transformed a killing into a statement. And the larger the crowd, the louder the statement. This is why executions in major Ottoman cities were timed to coincide with market days, religious festivals, the arrival of caravans. Any occasion that guaranteed a maximum population in the square. The goal was not convenience. The goal was audience size. The state was broadcasting, and it wanted the largest possible reach. But the system operated on a second level as well, one that is easy to overlook. The people who witnessed a public execution did not simply return to their lives and forget what they had seen. They talked about it. They described it to family members who had not been present. They mentioned it to neighbors, to business partners, to travelers passing through. The original audience of hundreds in the square became an audience of thousands in the retelling, and the retelling preserved the essential emotional core even as the specific details changed. The Ottoman state understood this, even without having a vocabulary for what we would now call network effects. It understood that the square was not the endpoint of the message. The square was the origin point. The message traveled outward through human social networks, losing some fidelity but gaining reach, until it had penetrated communities that were nowhere near the original event. There is something worth noting about the Sultan's relationship to this system. In almost every case, the Sultan himself did not attend public executions. He was absent, sometimes in a palace room overlooking the square, visible to no one, or sometimes not present in the city at all. This absence was not indifference. It was strategic. The Sultan's personal association with the act of killing was something to be managed carefully. He was above the spectacle, not part of it. His will had been done, but his hands were clean in the sense that mattered for public perception. The executioner bore the physical reality of the act. The Qadi bore the legal authority. The officials who organized the event bore the administrative responsibility. The Sultan bore only the sovereign will that had set it all in motion. This distribution of visible responsibility allowed the state to calibrate how the event was understood. If a punishment later seemed excessive, the executioner could absorb the blame. If it seemed just, the Sultan could receive the credit. The system was structured to protect the summit of the hierarchy from the full weight of what its lower levels were doing. Return for a moment to the square in 1561. The ordinary people who had stopped to watch. The women on their way to prayer, the men on their way to market, the children who had simply followed the crowd. They were not there by accident. They were there because the event had been publicized, because the timing had been chosen, because the square had been selected for its foot traffic rather than its legal significance. Their presence was the product of planning. And when they walked away. When the market resumed and the prayer calls sounded and the city returned to its routines, they carried something with them that the state had just installed. A memory it had authored, a lesson it had crafted, a fear it had calibrated to last for exactly as long as the state needed it to last. That was the psychology. And it was working on a population the Ottoman state needed to manage across distances and differences that would have broken most imperial systems entirely. The Ottoman punishment system did not apply uniformly. It had a hierarchy, not just of severity, but of purpose. Who was being punished, and why, determined not just what happened to them but how it happened and in front of whom. Understanding that hierarchy reveals something important about how the state actually thought about power. At the base of the hierarchy were ordinary criminals. Thieves, fraudsters, violent offenders. People whose crimes were against other individuals or against the general social order. These people were punished by the legal system in its most conventional sense. The Qadi's court, the established tariffs of punishment, the standard procedures. Their punishments were public when they needed to produce deterrence and private when they did not. They were not political instruments. They were administrative outputs. One level up were rebels. People who had actively resisted Ottoman authority, whether through armed uprising, refusal to pay taxes, or organized resistance to imperial administration. These cases were political by definition, and their punishments were designed accordingly. They were almost always public, almost always elaborate, and almost always staged in locations chosen for visibility rather than convenience. A rebel executed in the center of the city he had tried to hold against Ottoman forces was sending a message not just to the population of that city but to every other city in the region that might be contemplating the same. Then there were the rivals. The Ottoman imperial system had a structural problem that it never fully solved. The sons of a sultan were all potential successors, which meant they were all potential threats to whoever actually took the throne. The law of fratricide. Formally institutionalized by Sultan Mehmed II in the late 15th century, gave the reigning sultan the right, and arguably the obligation, to execute his brothers upon accession. This was not a secret. It was written down, debated by legal scholars, and justified on the grounds that civil war was worse than fratricide. The justification was not entirely cynical. Ottoman history had enough examples of destructive succession conflicts to make a strong case that eliminating rivals at the moment of succession produced more stability than the alternative. But the execution of royal sons was also one of the clearest examples of the system treating the punishment not as a response to a crime but as a management of a structural risk. The brothers had done nothing. Their existence was the problem. Provincial governors occupied a complicated position in this hierarchy. They were agents of the empire, trusted with significant power and resources. They were also potential rivals, potential defectors, and potential sources of instability if they became too powerful or too autonomous. The Ottoman state managed this by making gubernatorial punishment highly visible within the governing class itself. An official executed for corruption was not just being punished for what he had done. He was demonstrating to every other official what could happen to them. There are documented cases of governors who were executed for offenses that, in a purely legal sense, were relatively minor: administrative irregularities, disputes with local religious authorities, personal conduct that offended the wrong people at court. The legal justification existed but was not the primary driver. The primary driver was the need to remind the gubernatorial class as a whole that their position was provisional, their authority borrowed, and their survival contingent on the continued confidence of the center. Non-Muslim minorities, the dhimmi populations of Christians, Jews, and others living under Ottoman rule, had their own complex relationship to the punishment system. In principle, they were governed by their own religious courts in matters of personal law, and their access to the Qadi courts was voluntary. In practice, when the state needed a visible example and the political calculus made a minority community the appropriate target, the rules of dhimmi protection could become very elastic very quickly. This was not the routine experience of minority life under Ottoman rule, which for much of the empire's history was considerably better than minority life in contemporary European states. But it is the part that the official narrative of Ottoman tolerance tends to skip. The tolerance was genuine and it was also conditional. The conditions were set by the state. And when the state needed something, the conditions could change. The machine did not just punish crime. It managed perception of power. And it targeted different populations in different ways, always asking the same underlying question: what does this punishment need to produce, in which audience, and how do we engineer that outcome as efficiently as possible? Every empire produces two kinds of records. The first kind is the official version, the chronicles, the legal codes, the administrative registers, the court histories commissioned by sultans who wanted to be remembered in specific ways. The second kind is everything else: the letters of foreign observers, the complaints of provincial subjects, the informal accounts that slipped through the official filter because they were not considered important enough to control. Ottoman official records were remarkable for their sophistication. The empire's bureaucracy was one of the most developed of the medieval world, producing detailed registers of land ownership, tax revenue, population surveys, court decisions, and imperial correspondence. These records have survived in abundance and tell us an enormous amount about how the empire functioned. They also tell us, very carefully, what the empire wanted to say about itself. The official chronicles written under sultanic patronage described a civilization of justice, piety, and order. The punishments that appear in these records are always proportionate, always legally grounded, always expressions of divine will operating through the proper channels. The elaborate public executions, the calculated spectacles, the 3-day displays of executed bodies, these rarely appear in the official account at all. When they do appear, they are framed as necessary responses to extraordinary threats, not as standard operating procedure. The executioner's manuals do not survive in abundance. The practical instructions for how to conduct specific types of public punishment, the angle of the stake, the calibration of bastinado, the staging of a maximum audience execution, were not the kinds of documents that official archivists preserved with care. Some of this was genuine administrative casualness about operational details that everyone already knew. Some of it was something closer to deliberate management of the historical record. European ambassadors' letters tell a different story. The diplomatic correspondence of Venetian, French, and Habsburg representatives at the Ottoman court is full of descriptions that do not appear in the official Ottoman chronicles. These men were professional observers, trained to notice and report what they saw, and they saw things that their Ottoman hosts would have preferred they overlook. They described public executions in detail. They noted the crowds. They commented on the deliberateness of the proceedings. They wrote, sometimes in the same paragraph, about the impressive fairness of Ottoman courts and the unsettling precision of Ottoman punishment. The gap between those two observations was not lost on the more perceptive of them. One Venetian ambassador in the late 16th century noted that the Ottomans appeared to maintain two distinct reputations simultaneously, one for legal sophistication, which they cultivated with foreign visitors, and one for fearsome severity, which they cultivated with their own population, and that these two reputations appeared to be maintained deliberately, each serving a different strategic purpose. He was right. And the Ottomans knew he was right. There is evidence in the diplomatic record that Ottoman officials sometimes arranged for foreign visitors to witness court proceedings specifically to build the reputation for legal sophistication, and arranged for them to not be present at certain public executions that might have complicated that reputation. The management of foreign perception was as deliberate as the management of domestic fear. What was being buried, then, was not the fact of the punishment. Punishment was too public to hide. What was being buried was the system behind the punishment, the deliberateness, the calibration, the explicit recognition that the spectacle was a tool of governance rather than an unfortunate necessity. The official record acknowledged that punishment existed. It did not acknowledge that punishment was engineered. The sophistication and the brutality were not opposites. One funded the other. The legal sophistication generated the legitimacy that made the brutality sustainable. The brutality generated the compliance that made the sophistication possible to maintain. Strip out either element and the system begins to fail. Too much sophistication without force and the empire becomes a philosophical exercise. Too much force without sophistication and the empire generates the kind of sustained resistance that eventually dismantles it from within. The Ottomans held that balance for longer than almost any comparable imperial system in history. They held it because they understood, at an institutional level, even when individual actors did not articulate it explicitly, that the two halves of the machine were not in tension. They were in service of the same goal. The Ottoman Empire did not end with the kind of sudden collapse that makes for clean historical narratives. It eroded, across more than a century, under the pressure of military defeats, economic strain, nationalist movements within its borders, and the sustained attention of European powers who had reasons to want it weakened. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century, a series of imperial edicts designed to modernize the empire's legal and administrative systems along European lines, included explicit prohibitions on certain forms of public punishment. Impalement was formally banned. Public torture as a judicial procedure was prohibited. The elaborate staging of executions that had characterized the earlier empire was replaced, at least on paper, with more restrained and more European-looking forms of legal process. On paper. In practice, the transition was neither clean nor swift. Provincial governors who had spent careers operating within the old system did not immediately begin conducting themselves differently because an edict had been issued in Istanbul. The gap between imperial decree and provincial reality had always been one of the characteristic features of the Ottoman system, and it remained characteristic during the reform period. Reports from provincial observers throughout the second half of the 19th century document the continued use of punishment methods that the Tanzimat had nominally abolished, sometimes with official sanction from local authorities, sometimes simply without official attention. The deeper problem was that the reforms were trying to change a practice without fully addressing the logic that had produced it. The public spectacle of punishment had not emerged from a cultural taste for cruelty. It had emerged from the specific administrative needs of a vast, diverse, multilingual empire that needed to communicate authority across distances and differences that resisted purely paper-based governance. The Tanzimat edicts changed the legal framework without changing those underlying needs. And so the underlying needs found other expressions. Modern Turkish historical memory has a complicated relationship with the Ottoman period. The empire is a source of genuine pride, centuries of civilization, legal sophistication, cultural achievement, military power. It is also a source of genuine difficulty. The same period contains episodes that modern legal and moral frameworks would classify without hesitation as atrocities. The national narrative that emerged from the founding of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s made choices about which parts of that inheritance to emphasize and which to handle more carefully. The punishment system was not the worst of those difficult episodes. But it is one of the most revealing, because it shows how the difficult and the admirable were not separate compartments of the same civilization. They were integrated. They were designed to work together. The courts that impressed foreign observers and the squares that horrified them were outputs of the same imperial logic, maintained by the same class of officials, in service of the same goal. That is the pattern, and it is not unique to the Ottomans. Every empire that builds a legal identity also builds a shadow system alongside it, a set of practices that the legal identity cannot fully accommodate but that the empire cannot function without. Rome had its arenas alongside its law courts. The British Empire had its colonial administration alongside its rhetoric of civilizing mission. The distance between a civilization's self-image and its methods is always, in every case, where the truth lives. The Ottomans were, in this sense, neither uniquely monstrous nor uniquely admirable. They were enormously competent at something that all empires must do, maintain authority across vast distances and profound differences, using a combination of legitimacy and fear calibrated carefully enough to keep the whole structure from collapsing under its own weight. They did it with the legal sophistication of the Cadi's court and the deliberate terror of the public square. They did it with the silk cord and the stake. They did it with 3-day displays of executed bodies and with the carefully managed absence of the Sultan from every scene of violence conducted in his name. And for 6 centuries, it worked. Go back to Istanbul. 1561, the man on the stake. We know now who ordered it, and in what sense. We know the legal logic that produced it, the Cadi's verdict, the governor's authority, the Sultan's invisible presence behind the whole proceeding. We know the crowd was not an accident of timing but an intended audience, gathered deliberately, their presence the point of the exercise. We know the executioner was a professional who had calculated the angle and the duration with the same care that a judge applied to the weighing of evidence. We know that the crowd dispersed eventually. The market resumed. The prayer calls sounded across the rooftops of the city and the people made their way to the mosques and then back to their lives. The body was taken down after the appropriate number of days. The square returned to its ordinary function as a place of commerce, of passage, of the unremarkable daily business of a city. But something had been installed in every person who had been there. A memory the state had authored. A fear the state had calibrated. A lesson about the distance between existing and belonging, between toleration and protection, between the ordinary routines of daily life and what lay on the other side of a decision to resist. That installation lasted. It was meant to last. The Ottoman state knew something that every subsequent empire has had to relearn, that the most durable form of control is not the one that is constantly visible but the one that has already made itself unforgettable. You do not need to threaten everyone every day if you have already given them something they will never stop remembering. The square in Istanbul in 1561 was not the dark side of the Ottoman Empire's legal sophistication. It was the other half of the same coin. The sophistication made the darkness sustainable. The darkness made the sophistication necessary. And the empire held both in its hands, for 6 centuries, with a steadiness that ought to make us think carefully about what we mean when we call a civilization advanced. Because advanced and brutal have never been opposites. In the architecture of power, they have almost always been partners.